I've been preaching through Romans chapter 12 on Sunday morning, so we're going to read this morning verses 13 through 16. The title of the message this morning is Transformed Attitudes. Paul writes this: share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Now, by the way, that verse, I'm reading it today, but we're going to deal with it next Sunday, in next Sunday's message, in the last sermon from this chapter, which will be with dealing with your enemies. So even though it's in the middle of our text today, it really goes with next week's message. Verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. This is a very difficult chapter to outline. One of the first things I do when I'm going to preach from a particular passage, I read through it and try to sort of outline it in my mind, and in particular to get kind of like, what's the single theme here of this passage? Because if I don't understand what the passage is about, I can't help you understand what it's about. So the first thing I'm trying to get to is, what is this about, and then what are the points it makes? This is a difficult chapter to outline. There's a great story about a seminary student who went to his homiletics professor. Homiletics is the study of preaching. And he goes to his homiletics professor and he asks him, how many points should a sermon have? And the professor said, at least one. And there's some great truth there, that a message is built around a single point that should run through the message. But Paul jumps around so much here in this passage that it's hard to kind of figure out what that single point is. So I pulled down one of my favorite commentaries on Romans, pulled it down from my library shelf, and I thought, let me see what this great Bible scholar says about this passage. Let's see how he outlined it. So I pull it down, open it up to his section, his chapter on these verses, and the very first sentence he writes, I kid you not, this is a difficult chapter to outline. Well, thanks a lot. My first thought was I was going to try to do all of these verses together, verses 13 through 21, but there is a difference there are two different trains of thought that run through them. One is about our attitudes, and the other is more external. In other words, the internal, your attitudes toward other people, and then one more external. How do you deal with people who mistreat you? Next week's message will be entitled The Christian and His Enemies. That's not to say that you think of people as your enemies, but just dealing with people who mistreat you, people who aren't kind to you, people who talk about you, talk bad about you and all that. So that'll be next Sunday. So this morning about transformed attitudes, going back to what Paul said in the very first verses of this chapter, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so here, about how our attitudes are transformed as Christians. So he says three things here that I want us to look at. One is in verse 13, one in verse 15, one in verse 16. The first one in verse 13, I'll say, be generous. That's the Christian attitude there, be generous. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Practice hospitality. Now, it doesn't come across so much in English, but in the original language, it comes across very, very clearly. Paul's making a contrast here. Contribute to the needs of the saints. That's your Christian brothers and sisters. The other part that's translated as practice hospitality in the Greek language is literally love strangers. And so Paul's saying here, you have an obligation to be generous to your Christian family, and you also have an obligation to help strangers who are in need. Let's take the first one first. Contribute to the needs of saints. That word contribute, by the way, it's not really just talking about money. We get our English word fellowship from this word, koinonia, and it means literally to have things that we join together, to participate in. So it could include money, but it goes beyond that, and it includes just doing what you can do to help those in need. In 1988, we were overseas. We were in Argentina, and I was at a pastor's conference one day. And wasn't, not like a big special meeting. It was just a regular monthly meeting of pastors in that area. And at that time, there had been great torrential storms in Brazil. Brazil and Argentina are neighboring countries there in South America. Over 500 people had died. Thousands upon thousands lost their homes. There were torrential storms that swept through and actually swept some cities away. One of the cities that we had considered going to as missionaries before we ended up in Argentina was in Brazil, a city called Petrópolis. It's gone. It was literally swept away in that flood. So as the pastors were talking about what had happened that day, these men weren't from Brazil. Most of them had never been to Brazil. They didn't know people in Brazil. But they started taking money out of their pockets or reaching into their wallets. And it was all the money that they had on them. And in many instances, it amounted to maybe like $1 or $2. But they took it out and they laid it on a table and they said, we want to send this to our Christian brothers and sisters in Brazil. Now that's the spirit of what Paul is talking about here. That when you see a Christian brother in need, a Christian sister in need, you've got an obligation there, Paul is saying to us. But I don't want to just say it as an obligation. It's coming from the heart here, from our transformed attitude to help those in need. And then the other thing, practice hospitality, like I said, that's really more about strangers. Be a friend of strangers would be a good way to say it. I said it could be translated as love strangers, but he uses that word for friendship, kind of love. Be a friend to strangers here. Now this was a big thing in the Old Testament among the Jewish community, to help strangers. We sort of get the idea, I think, today that, just anybody who came through town, people just opened up their doors for them and let total strangers in, and that's not exactly what happened. Typically strangers would travel, or if you were going to be sojourning through an area where you would be a stranger, they traveled with letters of recommendation. It would be from respected people in the area where they were, and so they could show them to people who might take them in. And they did this within the Jewish community as a part of understanding their obligation to one another. So when Paul says be a friend to strangers, he's not saying, don't be stupid. There are a lot of evil people in the world who will not only take advantage of you, they'll hurt you. So Paul's not saying here, just be stupid. But he is saying, be a friend to strangers. Within the confines of being wise about this, be a friend to strangers. Just as the Jews felt they had an obligation to one another, as Christians we have an obligation to those in need, whether they're fellow Christians or not. Again, this is a story from Argentina, something that happened once where I was a stranger in Argentina. We lived in Buenos Aires, the capital city. It's right there by the Atlantic Ocean. There was a missionary team that came in from the United States. They were from Mississippi. They were going to be cross-country, and they needed translators. None of them spoke Spanish, so they needed some missionaries who could go there to translate for them during the week that they were there. And the mission asked me if I would be one of the translators. So I took a 14-hour bus ride across the country to be a translator. Now, we were guests for that week in the home of some of the Argentine Christian families. And at this one home where we were going to be staying that night, way out in the country, what they call the campo there, the pastor pulled me aside and he said, now look, the home you're going to be staying in tonight, he said, these people are very poor. So you need to be, be prepared for that. They call them campesinos, they're very, very poor people way out in the country, they usually have nothing. Now you need to know that in Argentina, beef is a big part of their culture. They pride themselves on having the best beef in the world, and I think they do. It's wonderful. And they've got these, these grasslands that stretch on for millions of acres with deep, deep topsoil. It's a big thing in Argentina. They pride themselves on it. The average Argentine family eats beef twice a day, every day. And so if you were to have someone in your home and you didn't serve them beef in Argentina, that would be considered, you were a very poor host. Now this pastor had warned me these people could never afford to eat beef because it's expensive there just like it is here. So he was warning us. I wouldn't have been expecting beef, but I guess this Argentine pastor, he would have expected to go into a home, people serve you beef. So he was cautioning us, don't expect anything like that. So we sat down at the table, and the lady of the house, she goes into the kitchen and comes out with a big platter, and it's covered. Whatever it is, I'm happy to eat it, So she sets it down on the table and lifts the cover off. It's a big plate of fat. She had gone down to the butcher. She felt to be a good host, she needed to serve us beef, but this family could never afford to actually buy beef. So what she did, she went down to the butcher. And you know how a butcher would trim off the fat from the meat he's going to sell? She bought that from the butcher. Now here, 20-something years later, that's still one of the most memorable meals I've never had. Not one of the best meals I've ever had. I've got to tell you, it was hard to eat. But when I looked at her and saw the joy that she felt in her heart, that she was able to do something for us, and she didn't know us. Not only did I live across the country, wasn't even an Argentine, I'm just some American to her with these other Americans who are there. But she felt, as a Christian woman, she felt so compelled to do something. This love of strangers that Christ had put into her. I'll tell you, it brings a tear to my eye, even now, a quarter of a century later, to remember what she did. And I know she spent money that she didn't really have, but she did it because the Lord had put that love into her heart. And I think that captures the spirit of what Paul is saying here. As a Christian with a transformed attitude, you owe it to others to be generous. To your Christian family, but also to the stranger in your midst. And then the second thing is in verse 15. I'll call this one, just to try to make these simple to remember, I'll call this one, be sympathetic. Paul says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I didn't know whether to say this was empathy or sympathy. I looked them up in the dictionary. The dictionary says sympathy is to feel compassion for someone. Empathy is to feel what another feels. They're both okay, I think. Either word kind of works okay. I'll just say that Paul is saying here to be sympathetic, so be generous. That's one transformed attitude, be sympathy. There's an old saying that a sorrow shared is but half a trouble. A joy that is shared is a joy made double. And that's what Paul is saying here. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Let's take the first one, rejoice with those who rejoice. I've heard people say it's harder to rejoice with those who rejoice than it is to weep with those who weep. Do you think that's true? I don't know about that. I'd never had that thought before. But as I was preparing for this message, I had several people, who wrote about this chapter, made that comment, that they find that harder to do. The only way I could think where I guess that would be true is if maybe the person's rejoicing at something that happened to them at your expense. This sort of this passage is in the context of persecution. And so maybe what Paul has in mind here when he says rejoice with those who rejoice, at least in the sense that this is difficult, is maybe like that person who got a promotion that you thought you were going to get. That kind of thing. Or that person who has succeeded by doing damage, say, to your reputation, something like that. I don't know if that's really what Paul is getting at here, but maybe. I do know people can struggle with that. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969. This is a true story. One day the phone rings in their house. Now his wife, who was also a writer, their marriage was greatly strained by his success as a writer. She was a writer but had no success or recognition at all, whereas he was increasingly more successful, more popular and whatnot. So one day the phone rings in their house. She picks it up and she listens for a little while and she gets this look of horror on her face. And she listens for a little while and says, okay, and then hangs up the phone. And he knows something terrible has happened and he says, what is it? What's wrong? And she says, "You've just been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature." That was the worst news she could get, because she already hated his success. So maybe that's what Paul has in mind here. I don't know. I do know this, that there are very few opportunities we get in life to show the love of Christ more than when we rejoice with those who rejoice. And that's especially true if their success has come at your expense. Let me give you an example from the sports world. Back in 1991, those of you who are baseball fans, you know the names Lou Brock and Rickey Henderson. Now, Lou Brock, during his day, he played for the St. Louis Cardinals, my favorite team as a boy growing up. Lou Brock had set the Major League Baseball career record for stolen bases. And he kept that record from 1979 until 1991, when a guy named Rickey Henderson came along, left fielder for the Oakland Athletics. And Rickey Henderson was a speed demon. Boy, he got on the base. Second base was stolen. That was just a foregone conclusion. And over time, Rickey Henderson in 1991, he was about to tie Lou Brock's record. And the sports announcers, Lou Brock was long since retired, but they asked him, "Are you going to be there in Oakland when Rickey Henderson ties your record?" Thinking that, Lou Brock was going to badmouth him, And Lou Brock said, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't miss it." And he praised Rickey Henderson, what a great player he was, and how Rickey did in 12 years what it took me 19 years to do. And he just, everything he said about Rickey Henderson was positive. When I read that, you know what I did? I got on the internet and started looking up something about Lou Brock, because I said to myself, that man is a Christian. He has to be, because that's a Christ-like spirit coming through in him. And do you know what I found out? Devout Christian, very popular speaker at Christian conferences and whatnot. I knew it before I knew it. Just from reading it, I knew this, only Christ could put that kind of spirit into a guy's heart. And so Paul says, rejoice with those who rejoice, just like Lou Brock did with Rickey Henderson. And then he says, weep with those who weep. I've had a lot of people tell me, I know so-and-so's maybe sad or going through a hard time, but I've kind of avoided them because I don't know what to say. And I understand that feeling, because we feel like somebody's got a problem, it's up to us to solve it. You don't have to solve somebody's problems to just be there with. You notice Paul doesn't say when somebody's weeping, go over there and fix their problem for them. He just says weep with. And man, sometimes that's enough, isn't it? You may be going through a hard time, and just to have somebody who comes to sit with you and say, man, I'm really sorry. And that's all. And it's enough. Have you ever heard of sympathy dogs? Do you know what they are? These are dogs that have been trained to just sit with either the elderly, like in nursing homes, or the sick in hospitals. You can see videos of them on YouTube. They're amazing. And there is great therapeutic effect when these dogs, all they do is lie there on the bed of some sick person. And obviously the dog's not solving any problems. It's not giving them any advice. It just lies there, and the people pet them, and the dog cuddles up with them. And they say it has great benefit to the person who's sick or confined or troubled. Just the dogs being there. Now, I'm not comparing you to dogs, but do that. What Paul is talking about here when he says weep with those who, just be there with them. You don't have to fix anybody's problems. Just be there with them. And then verse 16, I'll say this is be humble. So here's the transformed attitudes. Be generous, be sympathetic, be humble. Now Paul says three things in this verse. There are three sentences, but they're all about humility. The first one is live in harmony with one another. That's the NIV translation that I'm reading from here. I think the King James says be of the same mind. Some of the translations say be united. Let there be no discord or disagreement among you. But he's talking about Christians living in harmony with other Christians. And can we be honest and admit that Christians haven't always done a good job in this? The Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church split in the year 1054 over one word in the Nicene Creed. And here we are a millennium later with two very distinct branches of Christianity over a disagreement on one word. 500 years later, during the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and Zwingli from Switzerland, one of his contemporaries, also a reformer, they split over the idea of communion. Luther still holding on to the Catholic view that the Lord is actually present in the communion elements, and Zwingli saying no, it's just symbolic, just representative. And so they split, two separate Protestant churches starting over there. I've heard of churches that split over, what time to worship, styles of worship. There's a story, it was told to me as true, I think it is, of a guy who was traveling through a small town, and he stopped to eat at this intersection where there were four corners, the intersection, and there were 3 Presbyterian churches there on three of the corners. The fourth was that restaurant where he was eating, and so he asked the waitress, he said, "What's the deal? Why are there 3 Presbyterian churches all next to each other like that at the same intersection?" She said, "Well, that church over there, that's a United Presbyterian church, and that church over there, that's a Reformed Presbyterian church." And he said, "Well, what about the third one over there?" She said, "They're neither United nor Reformed." We spend a lot of time in church talking about Christians loving one another and about blessing those who persecute us and loving our enemies. But can we be honest and admit that in churches all across America, there are people sitting in the pew next to each other who have grudges against one another? They refuse to let go of petty little grievances. They carry petty hurts with them and refuse to forgive one another. And when we do this, it's such a poor witness to the world. It's such a poor witness to the world. I've shared with you before this church in Argentina where they actually got into fistfights with each other, and it spilled out. They like something from a comedy, a Hollywood comedy. They spilled out of the building, out into the outer garden area, punching one another. And all the neighbors came out, and stood at their fences to watch them. Now, how many decades do you think the cause of Christ was set back in that neighborhood by that kind of behavior? So, this is important what Paul is saying, to be in unity with one another. Let's practice forgiveness and just tolerance with one another. Let's not expect perfection from one another. We're all sojourners on that same journey, brothers. We're all going to the same place. And when your brother stumbles along the way, help him get back up and help him get back on the way with you. And then he says, don't be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Jesus was the perfect example with this, right? He was a friend of sinners. When Jesus came to Jerusalem, he stayed in the home of Mary and Martha out in the little suburb of Bethany. He didn't go to the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Jerusalem, to stay. He was humble. Even his birth, his entry into the world was humble. And so Paul says, don't be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. And then the last thing, don't be conceited. And I think the real reason for this, conceit, Paul touches on earlier in the chapter. You remember what he said in verse 3 when he says, don't think too highly of yourself? Well, here it is again. When you forget that you were once a lost sinner, just like everybody else, that's when you start looking down your nose at people. But if you'll keep that thought in your mind and in your heart, I'm a sinner saved by grace just like everybody else, it's easier to sort of have that attitude that Paul is talking about here, these transformed attitudes that bless our enemies, that empathize with others in their joy and sorrow, and exhibit genuine humility. We can only do that when we're more concerned about others' eternal welfare than we are about our suffering. We can only rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep when we take the focus off of ourselves and put it on the other people. We can only be of the same mind with one another and forgiving of one another when our eyes are on the Lord and not just on ourselves. I'm going to ask you to bow with me as we just pray to end the message today. And let me just ask you some questions here as we close in prayer. Thinking about your attitudes today, do people who know you out in the world, do they recognize you as a Christian? Do they see a difference in you and in your attitudes? If not, is there an attitude that you need to change today? Maybe you're in a difficult situation and it's trying you, it's taking all you've got, but you realize that maybe your attitude hasn't been what it should be. Once you just right now, just quietly in your heart, ask the Lord to help you with that attitude. Maybe somebody's treated you unkindly and you need to respond with love rather than hate. And so ask the Lord to help you do that this morning. Maybe there's a circumstance in your life where you realize you need to be more of a blessing than you've been. Ask the Lord to help you do that today. Maybe there are people around you who are rejoicing, and it's been hard for you to join in. Maybe you've sort of been raining on their parade because maybe their success came at your expense. And so would you ask the Lord today to increase your joy and help you to be a blessing to those around you. Maybe you haven't been helping people who are suffering and hurting because you feel like you don't know the right words to say. Ask the Lord to relieve you of that burden today and just to help you just to be there with somebody, just to sit with them in silence and share their pain. Maybe you've been building up walls between you and other people instead of building bridges. Would you ask the Lord today to help you to build bridges and not walls? Help you to heal and not to hurt. You know, Jesus never said being his disciple was going to be easy. In fact, he went out of his way to say it was going to be hard. And our challenge today is to let the love of Christ flow through our transformed attitude. And that's a big job. So let's pray this morning and ask the Lord to help us do that. Heavenly Father, we know that at our very best, we are imperfect vessels. We are sinners saved only by your grace. But even in our imperfection, we desire to serve you. We desire to be pleasing to you. We desire that your love would flow through us to other people who are hurting, who are in trouble, or even those who are rejoicing. Help us to just get ourselves out of the way today, that you can work through us to be a blessing to others. This is our prayer today in Jesus' name. Let's conclude this morning by singing one stanza of Make Me a Blessing.